Today we're going to talk about the 6 trials of Jesus, but before we get there, I have to lay the groundwork, because as with everything in the Bible, you have to get back to the beginning.
The foundation.
Right. And the beginning really starts with Jacob and Esau. And that's kind of a surprise, but when you look at it, if we look at the blessing that Jacob received, and he was to get the blessing. Remember when they struggled in the womb in Genesis 25, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it be so, why am I thus?" And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Now that was before they're even born. God decided it.
That's the way it's going to be.
That's the way it's going to be. Now you can imagine in a culture where the eldest son got a double portion, Esau is not willing to accept that, right? You know, and he's the older brother, and I'm sure he picked on Jacob just like older brothers always do, you know. But after Jacob received his blessing, interestingly, is this, when he received the blessing pretending to be Esau. Therefore God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren. Let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. Now notice Jacob is given the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth. That's really, really important. Because after Esau comes, he demands a blessing also. Now listen to Jacob's blessing, or Esau's blessing. And Isaac his father answered and said, Behold, thy dwelling shall be in the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. So where's Esau going to dwell? He's always going to be among Jacob, because that's what the blessing said. Didn't say he got the fatness. Didn't say he got the dew of heaven. It says he will dwell in the fatness and the dew.
He's going to be living off his brother. In other words,
Yeah.
Well, we need to kind of keep the questions to a minimum, because we're going to record this today. Other people are going to want to, I said they want to see this. So.
That bless thee and curse thee thing, I didn't ever get that actually.
I know, I was rereading this and it jumped out at me. And the rest of Esau's blessing, and by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother, and it shall come to pass when thou shalt have the dominion, thou shalt break his yoke off his neck. So at some point, Esau gets the dominion, but that isn't the birthright, okay? It's important to understand that, because nowhere does it ever say, Jacob, you're going to lose the birthright. And Jacob still has the birthright to today. Now, this sets up, when we go through the scripture, we find out that after he received this blessing, it says, And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of my mourning for my father at hand, then will I slay my brother Jacob. Now God didn't allow him to slay Jacob, but Esau hates Jacob. And nowhere in the scripture can you find that Jacob hates Esau. There's times when Jacob feared Esau, you know, when he was coming back and stuff. But this is a situation we have to this day, and it's also a situation that happens with the time of Christ. Because we have, in 925 is when you have the split of the kingdoms. You have the northern house go one way and the southern kingdom go another. And because both houses rarely obeyed God, eventually that led to Israel being divorced, and that's the book of Hosea. That's why Hosea had to marry an adulterous woman, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And then it fits into God's law, because when God divorces Israel, he has to send her out of his house. So they have to go out of the land. They can't be in the land God gave them, and they never can go back. And this is something that the Judeo-Christians don't understand, because they keep talking about the Jews going back to Palestine, that it was prophesied that they go back. Not the northern house. The northern house was never to go back because they were divorced. They don't belong in God's house when they're divorced. They'll eventually be in God's house again, but not at this time period. So in 722 BC, Israel was invaded, conquered, and deported to Assyria, along with 200,000 Judahites. Now, the reason we know that there were 200,000 Judahites is Sennacherib actually built a monument that states this, and that monument was found. And think about that. God made sure that Israel had the house of Judah with them because that's the ruling tribe, right? And within the kingdom of Judah, you have the Levitical priesthood. So he made sure that they had kings among them and priests among them. So once Assyria collapses, these people then go through the Caucasus Mountains into Europe and the British Isles, as foretold in Isaiah 42, verses 16 through 19, Psalm 2:8, 2 Samuel 7:10, Jeremiah 31, 7 through 10, Hosea 8:8. So these people never go back to Palestine. Now we go forward to 607 BC, and that's when Babylon starts attacking the southern kingdom of Judah. And this is, or Jerusalem. Yeah, in Jerusalem, southern kingdom. Now this is all in Jeremiah. Jeremiah told them that this would happen. And this is when the 70 years starts for their captivity to Babylon. And from 607 BC to 586 BC, there's sieges going on back and forth. And it isn't until 586 that you finally have the small 2 to 3 million that were deported to Nebuchadnezzar, deported around Babylon. But at the end of the 70-year captivity in 537, you have 42,000 Judahites returned to Jerusalem. Now think how many millions of Israelites are out there who've gone through up to Europe. So this is a very, very small number that ends up in the land of Palestine. Now, while the house of Judah was gone with this captivity, the Edomites moved in. You know, I mean, that's the history of man, isn't it? If there's vacant land, somebody moves into it. So the Edomites are in there, and it isn't until Ezra and Nehemiah go back, rebuild the wall, and then they divide the people, remember, by their genealogies. And some of them are kicked out with their mixed multitudes. And interestingly, some of those people ended up in Samaria, and this is where you get the Samaritans, okay? And this is from my dad was asked the question. He used to do a pamphlet called The Answering Service, and this was a question he was asked, and this is his answer. He was asked the question, who are these Samaritans? Samaria was the capital city of the 10-tribed house of Israel during the time of the divided kingdom, before the captivities. It was built by King Omri of Israel, thus the Assyrians called Israel by the name Beth Cumri, which means house of Omri. So in 724 BC, Shalmaneser began the siege of Samaria, and the city fell to his successor Sargon 3 years later. The Assyrians deported 27,280 people from that city, as almost all of them had already been deported earlier. Even so, many of the Israelites were left behind. Sargon settled many colonists from Babylonia and Hamath, 2 Kings 17:24, and his grandson Esarhaddon and later monarchs continued this policy by introducing Elamites into the land as well. Thus, they had an integrated society. During this time, the foreign colonists, who were idolaters, decided the local gods of the land were unfavorable to them. So they requested that an Israelite from the Assyrian captivity come and teach them the ways of God. The result was a curious mixture of idolatry and the law of Moses. They rejected the writings of the prophets, accepting only the law of Moses. These were the people that the Judeans found in the land 2 centuries later when they returned to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. When Ezra and Nehemiah would have nothing to do with those who had intermarried and those who had a mixed religion, the conflict began between the Judeans and the Samaritans, as they came to be called. One of the Samaritan governors, Sanballat, Nehemiah 2:10, opposed the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, and he later built the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. Their doctrines did not differ greatly from that of the Judean Sadducees of Christ's days. Now remember, Christ heals 10 lepers, remember that? And he tells them to go to the priest. Well, they didn't go to the priest in Jerusalem. They went to the priest because they were Samaritans. They went to the other priest. And that's one of the things that's really important to understand, is though they were not Israelites, they were mixed Israelites, and they had their own temple. So the Judeans did not associate with the Samaritans because of their conflicts recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. And some of the Samaritans, at least originally, were of Israelite stock, being left over from the Assyrian captivity. However, as time passed, there would have been fewer and fewer of them, which we see in countries where, where you're the minority, they tend to intermarry with the majority. So then we get to another important prophecy that also deals with when Christ came, and that's the 70 weeks of Daniel. Most of the Judeo-Christian world takes the decree by Artaxerxes and says that's the beginning of the 70 weeks, and they go up to right before Christ and say that's when the 69 weeks end, and then we have this period of time. For some reason, God stopped his clock and doesn't restart it until he returns. And their reasons for that stopping of the clock is varied, but none of them ever made any sense to me because God doesn't do that anywhere else in the scripture. But if we look at 457 BC is when Nehemiah, the wall's been rebuilt, and he reads the law to Israel. And if we start the clock of Daniel's 70 weeks at that time, it coincides just perfectly where we get to the 70th week of Daniel. And remember, in the 70th week of Daniel, in the middle, Daniel 9:26, and Messiah shall be cut off. So obviously, the 70 week of Daniel is during the time period of Christ. It starts at AD 27, and Christ is crucified AD 31. And that fits perfectly. And the end of the 70 weeks is with the death of Stephen. Then, from that point forward, we have been in the Great Tribulation. It's not this little 7-year period of time. It's a great period of time. And the Great Tribulation lasts from the time of Stephen's death, and we're in it now, and it lasts till Christ returns. So you have to understand that in the time frame also of Christ. Then, to get back to the Edomites, in 126, John Hyrcanus was the chief priest and theocratic king of Judea, and he was of Israelite descent. Okay? He extended the Judean control, and he absorbed Edom, into his kingdom. Okay? Now, he was a corrupt king, he was a corrupt high priest, and he did exactly what God told him not to do, and that was to absorb these. So they swear allegiance to the religion that we know as Judaism, because that's what this was, this corrupted form of the Old Testament religion. And he makes them swear allegiance to that. And over time, Josephus records that there existed two opposing religious sects in Judaism. Those of the conservative Pharisees and those of the liberal Sadducees. Sound familiar? Isn't that what we got today? John Hyrcanus was descended from a family of Israelite nobility, but he was governing a remnant of Israelite Judeans and a multitude of racially mixed Idumean Judeans who were strangers. He behaved in typical political fashion and worked to appease both groups. He found a way to have the support of the devout Israelites and also appeased Israel's enemies, the Edomites. From this time on, the Sadducee form of Judaism was embraced. This was more like secular humanism that's taught today, and was the very opposite, of course, of what God's Word teaches. And John Hyrcanus suffered the consequences of his actions in that he and his family were eventually slaughtered by the Idumeans, which are the Edomites. They're called Idumeans in the New Testament. So in 76 BC, his grandson, Hyrcanus II, had a bitter rivalry with his brother, Aristobulus II, and this gave General Pompey of Rome the pretense to restore stability in that, and he annexed Judea to Rome. So this is how Rome gets involved in the whole question. Now, think about this. A lot of the Romans were true Israelites. So again, you have this battle between the Israelites who have the fatness and the dew, and the Edomites that are always in there somewhere. Okay? The Romans put Antipater, an Edomite, as civil head, and his son Herod the Great solidified the Roman alliance, and he eventually murdered John Hyrcanus II, which was the grandson of the original John Hyrcanus. And 7 years after his appointment as king of Judea, Herod began his reign of terror. And we know that he, killed the babies trying to stop Christ. But interestingly, because they separated the kingship and the high priestship, you've got the kingship being held by the Edomians, the Edomites, which this is when they're given the dominion, but the high priest is still an Israelite. So it's a really mixed bunch. And if you'll turn to John 8, we see one of the places where we hear this, and we have to understand that the term Jew in the New Testament means people living in Judea. We're all called Americans. Black, Mexican, whatever, are called Americans. So it's only a geographical designation. And in John 8:3 we see, and then Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, if you continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed. So there were Jews that believed on Christ. And those of you who haven't read the new book we have called Jew and Non-Jew Israelite, he really lays this out as far as there were lots of, quote, Jews that believed on Christ. Well, why the difference? In John 11:45 it says, then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. Obviously, these are the Israelite Judeans. In John 12:11 it says that by that reason, that by reason of him, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Again, the Israelites were believing on Jesus in huge amounts of people. And we see in Acts 14, it came to pass in Iconium that they both went both together into the synagogue of the Jews and so spake that a great multitude both of Jews and also of Greeks believed. Now again, the Greeks were Israelites in the dispersion. In Acts 17 it says, but the Jews which believed not, moved with envy. Do we have the envy of Esau and Jacob again? I mean, it just shows up time and time again. Took upon them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. So over and over we see that it's those Idumeans that are constantly against Christ and creating the uproar. Dave, you want to put that up? And now we're going to look at a chart that Charles Jennings put together, and he has a 4-part series on this. And he shows that Jesus actually was tried 6 times. And I did not realize this. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And he gives the scripture verses. So Jesus is arrested in the evening. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record that, which I think is pretty interesting. You know, God gave us tremendous witnesses. You know, you're supposed to have 2 or 3 witnesses. But when we get to the trials, the trial before Ananias is only in John 18. Now, Ananias was the high priest, and he retired, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, becomes the high priest. But he's still in the Sanhedrin. Now, remember, the Sanhedrin is the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and there's people like Jesus' uncle, Joseph of Arimathea. So obviously there was Israelites on this Sanhedrin. Some people try to say that the entire Sanhedrin was of Edom, but I believe it's just like our Congress is today. It's a mixed multitude of people, because Jerusalem at this point is a mixed multitude of people, and they've all gotten there in there. You know, we got to be fair. You know how that argument goes. So at this point, Ananias, he questions Jesus, and we can turn to that in John 18:12. I moved and I didn't bring my, here's my Bible. And interestingly, you know, you can read these and not realize that there's, you know, going from one thing to another. It's not as clear as we would like it to be sometimes if we don't, but we have to dig and search. So John 18, verse 12, it says, then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So we're not given a lot of detail, are we? We just know he was taken before him. Then we continue on in for the second trial, you have to go down to verse 15, and we see then Simon Peter followed Jesus. So they went from one place to another, because you wouldn't follow somebody in the same room, and it wouldn't be listed that way. And so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus unto the palace of the high priest. Now that disciple was probably Judas, because he's working with the high priests and the Sadducees. But Peter stood at the door without. In other words, they wouldn't let him in to be at this trial. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So Peter is now brought in as a witness. Okay? Now, this is probably verse 17 shows, Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou one of this man's disciples? And he says, I am not. So this is when Peter denies Christ. Okay, so he's called as a witness. They're going to use him as a witness, and he says, I'm not a disciple. What am I doing here? He's basically shutting the door. And the servants and officials stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine, and Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them, and behold, they know what I said. So Jesus isn't giving them anything. And he's pointing out that he did things openly, and you guys are doing it in secret. This is not a trial, out in the open where there's, they're following the form of law.
Transparency.
Right. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officials which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? So he was angry. So you can imagine at this time, if he struck him, Jesus probably gets a bruise on his face, And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Notice he didn't get angry. He didn't respond in kind. He just asked the question, as he's so good at doing. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest, and Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. There they therefore said to him, Art thou not also one of his disciples? And he denied it and said, I am not. So he denied again. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? You'd think he'd remember the guy who cut off his ear, right? And Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Now, we get to the third trial, which is not listed in John. So it's a little bit confusing because John goes on to the fourth trial. The third trial takes place before the Sanhedrin, and we can turn to Luke 22. There are several places you can look there, but we'll go to Luke 22. Luke 22.
Verse 54.
66.
Okay,
There's one more here. Let's see. 60. Oh, I'm in 26. I knew I was doing something wrong. This is one of the longer chapters in the Bible, let me tell you. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council, saying, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I also ask you, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then said they all, Art thou then the Son of God? And he said unto them, Ye say that I am. So again, Christ didn't give him anything, did he? He wasn't a witness against himself. And that's a principle of Israelite law. You don't have to be a witness against yourself.
That's a great answer. You were
Yeah.
right in saying that I am.
And they said, what need we any further witnesses? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth. Well, what have they heard of his own mouth? See, Caiaphas, by this time, who's the head of the Sanhedrin, he's mad. You know, he's like, this guy isn't giving me anything. You know, he's not doing anything the way I want it. And he's mad. So now they've done their thing in the Judean way. Now they're going to send him to Pontius Pilate because they got to have Rome's permission before they do anything, because they are under Roman authority. So if we go back to John 18, we see that he's going before Pontius Pilate. So in John 18, verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled. Remember, the Judeans, who were part of the Sadducees and Pharisees, they considered the Roman government a bastard government, because they were the true government. So they're not going to defile themselves by going in to the hall, but they'll ask for Rome's permission, you know, to kill Christ. Pilate then went out unto them and said, what accusations bring you against this man? And they answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. So they didn't really give a charge. They're just saying he's a troublemaker. Then said Pilate unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled when he spake, signifying what death should he die. So they're bringing him to Pilate, and Pilate's like, you go try him. You're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong jurisdiction, basically, is what you know, Pontius Pilate is saying. So then they're trying to figure out, because they want Rome to condemn him. Okay? They want Rome to be the scapegoat. So that is actually the end. And the reason we know that is the end is because verse 33 says, then Pilate entered the judgment hall again. And I had never caught that. Okay, I was thinking this was all one event. But between 32 and 33, we have him going before Herod. So we're going to turn to Luke 23, verse 6. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he heard that, so this is probably the end of the, you know, before he sends him out, he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, and he sent him to Herod, who himself was also at Jerusalem at that time. So Pilate is recognizing the chain of command. Wait a minute, this guy's from Galilee. That's not my jurisdiction. My jurisdiction's Judea. So he sent him to Herod. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he, meaning Jesus, answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. So now,
standing here.
Yeah. So Pilate sent him to Herod because he's saying, I don't have jurisdiction. Herod does his thing and says, and mocked him and sent him back to Pilate. Well, now Pilate, he does have jurisdiction because the king has told him he has jurisdiction, right? So then we get to the sixth and final trial of Christ. In verse 33 that I just read a few minutes ago, in John 18, verse 3, then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again. So this is after he's gone to Herod. Herod's, 33. And then, and called Jesus and said unto him, art thou king of the Jews? Now listen to this when you think about this. King Herod has sent him to Pilate. So this is a very significant question that Pilate is asking Jesus, because basically he's saying, are you trying to usurp Herod's throne? Okay, and trying to get Jesus to admit to that. And Jesus answered him, saying, thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from thence. So Jesus is telling Pilate basically, look, I'm not trying to take Herod's kingdom, because my kingdom's not of this world. So Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Which would be a very valid question, because he said he had a kingdom, right? But it wasn't here. And Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. And that gets back to my sheep hear my voice. Now, interestingly, when you look at the time frame, these 6 trials take approximately 12 hours from between 9 p.m. on Tuesday evening to 9 a.m. Wednesday. Then Christ is crucified after this. And so somewhere around 9 a.m. in the morning, and remember, he hangs on the cross for 6 hours till 3 p.m. So, and then they have to take him down. Well, why do they have to take him down? Why didn't they leave his body? Well, we're in Judea. They're celebrating the Passover, okay? And this is before the high holy days. So all of this has to take place, and this is why the rush to have 6 trials, why they rushed from place to place to place. They're trying to get him condemned before the high holy days, which they can't do anything. So this is kind of an interesting situation. Dave, if you'll put the next one up. I've got stuff printed out for you. Now we get to remember that Jesus said that he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Interestingly, Bullinger points out this is not an idiom for how the majority of Judeo-Christians try to say that, well, 3 days could be any portion of days. Because he was very specific. He said 3 days and 3 nights. And the nights is what makes it not an idiom. Now, a lot of people argue about that, and it's interesting because I wanted to read you. This is another book that we have called Why I No Longer Observe Saturday as a Day of Rest. And he makes an interesting argument about this. He says, there are other scriptures which are overlooked that shed light and understanding on Matthew 12:40, which is the 3 days and 3 nights. There are even things that Christ himself said in other places of the gospel that seem to contradict what he said in Matthew 12:40. Since this is not possible, is there another explanation? In John 2:18 through 19, Jesus said, Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Notice he said in 3 days. Okay? Mark 8:31, Jesus said that after 3 days he would rise again. And then in Matthew 16:21, he said he would be raised up the 3rd day. So people use that to say, well, did he really mean a literal 72 hours? Well, Bullinger's point is, yes, he did mean a literal 3 days and 3 nights because of that nights. That changed the whole aspect. Because if you take Christ being crucified on Friday, he would have only been in the tomb Friday night, Saturday night, raised Sunday. That's only 2 nights. You still have 3 days, but you don't have the 2 nights. And I think that's really a very valid point. So in the year AD 31, which fits Daniel's 70 weeks, it fits perfectly here too, because Abib 14 is a Tuesday. And remember, they figured from evening to morning. So we go from midnight to midnight. They're going from the evening 6 to 6 in the morning. So it's a little, you gotta have to wrap your mind around that because it's a little different. So on Tuesday at 6 p.m. is the beginning of Passover, and they have the Passover evening. Christ is crucified Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., and he dies at 6 p.m., and then he's buried immediately because we're coming up on Abib 15th, which is a Sabbath. And they can't bury on the Sabbath. So they had to bury him before the Sabbath. Okay? And then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, High Holy Day, and Abib 16 in the Passover week is a work day. And interestingly, if you don't put this on the calendar correctly, you'll end up with a work day on a Sabbath day. Which shows you that you've got it wrong, because God would have never had that conflict. And then we have the weekly Sabbath. So the 3 days that Christ is in the grave, or the 3 nights Christ is in the grave, is all during this Passover time, so that nobody can go to the grave and check on it or do anything, because they're busy with the activities of the Passover. So Christ's resurrection, Charles put on there, is before 6 p.m. And the women go on Sunday and find the tomb empty. And his point is that Christ didn't rise on Sunday. He rose before that, but it was discovered on Sunday. But that way it fits the entire 3 days and 3 nights. And that's very different than, obviously, the Judeo-Christian world says. Another thing that the Judeo-Christian world gets mixed up in all of this is, if we turn to Matthew 21, they're very quick to quote this scripture whenever you bring up about some Jews believed and some Jews believed not. And this is Matthew 21:42. And Jesus said unto them, Did ye never read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, the same has become the head of the corner? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you, and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. And whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. Now they'll quote this and say, see, the kingdom was taken from Israel. Wait a minute, I beg to differ. The kingdom was taken from Israel back at the Assyrian captivity. They were divorced and sent out of God's house. They didn't have the kingdom. Only Judah had the kingdom. Then Judah loses the kingdom when they are taken into the Babylonian captivity, and a small remnant is allowed to return. But that's not very much of Israel. Most of Israel is gone at this point. And look at what he says. Therefore say I unto thee, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. Well, first of all, who's he talking to? And this is a very important point that you have to go back and find out that you have to go back to verse 23, which is quite a ways back, before you find out who he's talking to, because this is actually a pretty long conversation. In verse 23, and when he came into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching, and said, By what authority dost thou these things, and who gave thee this authority? So he's talking to the chief priests and the elders of the people. So he's basically talking to the Edomites. He's talking about the guys who were in power. Also, it says chief priests, so Caiaphas and Annas was probably there, and some of the Israelites that were in the priesthood were there. And he's saying, I'm taking this kingdom from you and giving it to the nation. Well, what nation is he giving it back to? He's giving it back to Israel, the true Israelites. He's taking it from the false Israelites and giving it to the true Israelites. And it always irritates me when I hear the Judeo-Christians talk about that, and they leave the impression that none of what they call the Jewish people or the Israelite people believed on Christ, when that's just not true. Read the New Testament. It says over and over that people believed on him. And Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. And Peter baptized 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. Yep.
And I come for only for the lost sheep.
Right, in Matthew 10. So,
15.
yeah, you're right. So, because they don't take the Old Testament and follow the history all the way through, and don't understand this struggle between Jacob and Esau, and that they would always be in the same parts of the earth fighting each other. Also, those of us who are from the tribes of Israel, we don't hate Esau. So we don't understand that Esau hates us. So we're always giving him the benefit of the doubt. We're always letting him in the sheepfold when he's a wolf. You know, he's not a sheep. And we always make that mistake. Now, it's funny when you go through the 70 weeks of Daniel with Judeo-Christians because they just will not accept. But I want us to read in Daniel 9 and see how beautifully this fits the crucifixion of Christ. So if you'll turn there. Let's see.
Do I stay on the screen?
9:26. You can go either way.
I don't know.
In Daniel 9:24, it says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression. Now, the holy city obviously is Jerusalem. To finish the transgression. What transgression? The transgression of the Israelites who've broken God's law over and over. To make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Well, who obviously is the most holy? Yeah. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. Did not Ezra and Nehemiah rebuild the wall? And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant. What covenant? Yeah. With Israel. With many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that, determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So the 70 weeks, Christ's death in AD 31 on the cross, following this timetable, fits perfectly in the middle of that week. The 70 weeks are done at the death of Stephen, and then following in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed, which is also given in that prophecy. So it just all fits perfectly. And it doesn't fit with a dispensational point of view. And it also doesn't fit with the idea that Christ was not 3 nights in the tomb. We have to always remember that he had to be 3 nights in the tomb. And a big hang-up for a lot of people is the concept that he didn't rise on Sunday, that he rose on Saturday evening. But again, I think a lot of that gets back to our being used to time going from noon to noon. You know, when we think of a day starting when we wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and going till evening, the whole Judean understanding was the day started at 6 p.m., went to 6 p.m. the next day. So they had a different frame of reference. And what I did is Charles has on I've got the charts in here for you guys, and then on his newsletter, he had an article that covers a lot of this. He doesn't get into John Hyrcanus, I got that information from another, but I put it in this little booklet form. And the charts I made bigger so that they didn't go in the booklet, but this is a 70 weeks of Daniel chart, and then the other chart is on the front and back of this one. So I have that for everybody.
That was really awesome.
Yeah, that was.
Whoa, I forgot I had the...
No, you need to put something together.
They wanted Barabbas or Jesus, and the crowd picked Barabbas. But even in picking Barabbas, interestingly, they picked the Son of God. Bar means son of. Abba means father, or son of the father. Abba means father. So Barabbas means son of the Father. And Jesus, of course, means son of the Father. So God caused the multitude not even to understand that by picking one or the other, they were still picking the Son of the Father. Wow. Isn't that neat?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a good joke on Facebook the other day. It said, remember, if you follow the crowd, you get Barabbas instead of Jesus.